Welcome to this breakout session on state-level climate policy. My name is Tony Dutzik. I'm the Associate Director and Senior Policy Analyst at Frontier Group. We are a nonprofit public policy organization whose mission is to provide information and ideas to build a cleaner, healthier, and more democratic America. And I am very pleased to be part of this rock star panel of folks who have been working in one way or another to address the climate crisis through transportation. And for those of you who are arriving at this session, you might be wondering, why are we having a conversation about state-level climate policy at a shared mobility conference? And really there's a couple of reasons. And the first one, and maybe the most obvious, is that, as Mary Nichols said this morning, transportation is now climate enemy number one in the United States. The transportation sector is our largest source of carbon pollution. If our transportation system were its own country, it would be the fifth leading emitter in the world. And there's no solution to global warming that doesn't involve addressing the sustainability of transportation in the US. And states are among the folks who are actually leading the challenge in the absence of leadership from Washington, DC. And so the second reason to be here is because states are taking the lead, and there are opportunities for the shared mobility sector if shared mobility can demonstrate itself to be part of a climate solution. And to be real about it from the very beginning, that proposition is pretty controversial. And if you talk to folks in the transportation world or in the environmental community, there are real questions about the degree to which shared mobility can make a serious contribution to the climate crisis, whether, as many of us hope, it can reduce car ownership and get us on a pathway to a more sustainable transportation system, or whether it increases the use of certain high carbon modes of transportation. So there's a real opportunity there for this sector and this industry, as well as a real set of challenges in being part of an overall solution. And today, with COVID-19 and many of the financial and other struggles that shared mobility providers are having, the importance of demonstrating the benefits of these services as to the public interest has really never been greater. So I'm really glad to be here with folks who have incredible on-the-ground experience in working with state climate level policy and transportation. And we're going to start off with Andrew Salzburg, who is a Loeb Fellow at Harvard University this year. And many of you may remember Andrew from previous shared mobility summits from his prior role at Uber. But Andrew is going to give us a 30,000-foot view of the climate crisis and transportation. We're then going to hear from Eugenia Gibbons, who is the Clean Energy Programs Director at the Green Energy Consumers Alliance here in Massachusetts. And Eugenia has been involved in efforts in the Northeast and Mid-Atlantic states to reduce carbon pollution, first from the electricity sector and now from transportation, as part of a very exciting initiative called the Transportation and Climate Initiative. And she's going to tell us a little bit about that program and its current status and some of the opportunities and challenges there. Next, after that, we're going to hear from Ryan Schuhard, who represents CALSTART, which is a nonprofit organization that works to accelerate the transition to clean vehicles and fuels. And Ryan is going to give us what will hopefully be, for most of us, a view of the future from the state that has been really leading many of the efforts to decarbonize transportation. That's California. And Ryan will talk a little bit about the California Cap and Trade program and some of the intersections there with shared mobility. And lastly, we're going to be hearing from Ricardo Godla, who is the Transportation Demand Management Program Supervisor at the Washington Department of Transportation. And he'll be talking to us about the commute trip reduction program in Washington, which is a long-standing and very successful effort to reduce the number of single occupancy commutes to and from workplaces. And he's going to tell us a little bit about that program and also about how that program is adapting to address the climate challenge. A couple of housekeeping things. One is that we're working very hard to make this an interactive conversation. And so two things to note about that. The first is that we are not going to be doing slides as part of this presentation, but several of the presenters have uploaded resources, which you're going to be seeing appear in the chat bar. These are reports, articles, slide decks, other things that you can virtually take home or take virtually home, I guess, from the conference, but resources that you might find helpful beyond this call. The second thing is that we're going to actually do something I haven't seen folks do yet in this conference, but we're going to be doing a few surveys via Zoom. So get your keyboards out because we're going to be doing the first survey question right about now. And we want to get a sense of who is in the room with us. So if you can just click on which sector you're representing, whether you're in the public sector, nonprofit, academic, or the private sector. And if the answer to this is none of the above, just click the one that is closest to what describes you. And if you can click submit on those, and we should get some results, I think, pretty quickly. Just give it a few seconds. Pete, will you be able to show those on the screen?
Are they not popping up for you?
I'm not seeing them yet.
Yeah, let's see. Click polls at the bottom. Can you not see the results?
Oh, yeah, okay. Okay. In the meantime, while we are figuring this out, I'm going to turn it over to Andrew, who is going to get us started with you.
Sure. And thanks for inviting me. It's great to be on the panel. I think I was invited, like Tony said, I have a free year for the last year at Harvard. So I've been thinking hard about how we actually address this problem in a way that meets the scale of the challenge. So just to give the super high level view, as Tony mentioned, you probably hear a lot about the need to decarbonize the entire global economy by 2050. So what does that mean for state level transportation policy in the US? So I think about that kind of stepping back from 2050, how close do we have to get to now to really be focused on the timelines that are going to matter? So obviously a global deadline is different than a deadline for developed countries like the US that in any decarbonization pathway should be ahead of the global pathway to decarbonization. So that puts you a few years earlier than 2050. You also think about transportation in most of the kind of economy-wide decarbonization pathways you see is one of the first sectors in the best case scenario to go to zero right after electric power generation. So that also makes it pretty early in that process. And if you dial in a little further to the topic this conference tends to cover, which is mostly on urban passenger transportation, which is only a piece of the overall transportation pie, that tends to be described as one of the easy parts of the transport decarbonization problem. So I think even there you want to bring your timelines back a little earlier, again, a few steps before. And the last part, as everybody on this call knows, transportation involves a lot of long-lived both vehicles and infrastructure. So if you're thinking about decarbonizing transportation in the US by 2040, that means you have to make some pretty concerted actions in the relatively near future to make those things happen. So I think kind of a handy way to think about that in some of the work that Tony's led with Environment America and others talks about getting all new cars to be electric by 2035, all buses to be electric by 2030, doubling the share of transit, walking, and biking. I think those are the kinds of level of ambition that's necessary to really be on a path that really actually equates to the scale of the problem. So that sounds daunting. And I think what I take some hope from is two things. I think one is the progress that's being made on the electric power side. So if you look at the costs of things like solar and wind, while there's still a relatively small share of the mix, I think that's gone faster than many would have predicted. It's not perfect. And frankly, a lot of those efforts have been led at the state level through things like renewable portfolio standards. There's a lot of positive things I think to take from electric power. And the other place I look for some hope is in the broader climate movement and the ambition of activists and advocates in the space, everything from Sunrise Movement to Extinction Rebellion to climate crisis being declared at the city level. All of that I think is injecting new urgency and more demands for rapid decarbonization. And all of that's really only in the last couple of years, if you look at it at scale. So I think, I take some hope that bringing a lot of that ambition into the transportation world, there's an opportunity for people like those on the call who have the technical skill around transportation to blend with the ambition that's out there in the broader climate movement, take some optimism from what's happening in electric power, which I think has sort of been the first sector to make some move. And if you take a combination of those things, I find some optimism amidst all the reasons for pessimism. So I'm excited to be on the panel and hear from others who are deeper in the fight. But it's been great to be looking at this problem over the last year in academia.
Great, thank you, Andrew. I think we might try to display maybe if you end the poll, we'll be able to see it. There it is. Can you all see the results? Okay, so we have a lot of public sector folks here, nonprofits. So a good spread of folks coming from a variety of different perspectives, and we'll really be looking forward to hearing from you in your various perspectives and backgrounds during the Q&A. So next I want to just turn it over to Eugenia.
Great, thank you. Thank you, Tony, and like everyone else, I'm really pleased to be here today. Would have been great to be together in Chicago, but this is all right too. So I'm Eugenia Gibbons. I'm the policy director at Green Energy Consumers Alliance. We are a nonprofit consumer and environmental advocacy organization whose mission is to harness the power of energy users to speed the transition to a low carbon future. So basically what that means is we work really hard to make green energy choices as simple as possible for everybody. And we use that experience to inform state level policy so that we can achieve solutions to scale. As Tony noted, most of our work, we're known mostly for the work that we've done in the electric sector around efficiency and renewables, but increasingly over the last several years, we've gotten very involved in advocacy related to vehicle electrification and transportation electrification for all the reasons that Andrew mentioned. It's the largest contributor to greenhouse gases. There are health impacts tied to, transportation sector pollution, and it's a real equity issue. And in Massachusetts, like many of the Northeast Mid-Atlantic states who are part of the Transportation Climate Initiative, we are presented right now with an opportunity through TCI to generate much needed revenue that could be reinvested in aging or non-existent transportation and transit infrastructure. And we have an opportunity, if we do TCI right, to make that transportation infrastructure as clean as possible and those investments as clean as possible. So what I am going to very quickly provide is a little overview of what TCI is, because you might not know. So TCI, the Transportation Climate Initiative, is a regional effort to establish a cap and invest program for transportation sector emissions. So essentially cap emissions from the transportation sector in the 12 participating states, and then generate revenue through the sale of allowances tied to the sale of fuel in those states, fuel distributed in those states. And then reinvested, those dollars would be reinvested into the participating states proportionally to the emissions coming out of each state. That's a really long way to say that, as I said, this is an opportunity to generate much needed dollars that could be redirected to solutions that are long overdue. And in the last couple of years, we've seen participating states, which I'll mention them later, but they've gone from agreeing that they need to address emissions from the transportation sector to agreeing that a cap and invest model is the best approach. And right now we're in the process of having the states finalize a memorandum of understanding that will ultimately inform the model rule that will be enacted at the end of the year. So it's been a very compressed amount of time, a very big undertaking. A lot of coordination has gone into making sure this can work. And in spite of the recent health crisis, states are not backing away from their commitments to TCI. So I look forward to discussing kind of what that could look like and how it could be implemented, but that's sort of what TCI is and why we're pushing so hard to make it happen.
All right, great. Thank you, Eugenia. And next we want to hear from Ryan.
Okay, great. Thank you. Well, we were taking bets on whose kids were going to be the first to burst into the door. Now I'm feeling some pressure here. Nobody's had it happen yet. Now it's lunchtime where I'm sitting. So we'll see what happens. So thank you, Sharon and Brian and the SUMSI team for inviting CALSTART to be here, and thanks Rudy P and Tony for organizing this good panel. So I'm Ryan Schuhart. I lead the Innovative Mobility Program for CALSTART, which is focused on putting zero-emission vehicles to work for creating more mobility options for all people. And for those who don't know CALSTART, we are an industry consortium that's working to accelerate the commercialization of clean transportation technologies nationally and internationally. We've been around since 1992. We have about 200 members that include lots of transit agencies and cities. So that's like LADOT, Utah Transit Authority, City of Chicago. We also have VIA, Coaster Cycles, Envoy, and NetLift in our membership. And we work in about three main ways. One is to lead technology demonstration, assessment, and validation projects for the whole range of vehicles, from bikes to buses to trucks to low-speed automated transit vehicles. We do policy development, so that's federal and state level, and then also for the gamut of legislative to regulatory to utility proceedings. And then finally, we do what we call market acceleration. And this is an area of work to administer clean vehicle incentive programs, which is something that we have a unique expertise in. And it is our area of work in which we're supporting the California's Clean Mobility Options Voucher Pilot Program. And that's really what I'm here most to talk about today. So just to transition to that quickly, what I'll do is I'll give just sort of a quick overview, which I expect is kind of an introduction for most folks. And I suspect we'll get into some of the details later. So first, Tony did provide a link on the chat to some of our slide presentations. There's about a 10-slide deck that is basically the slide presentation that you can refer to on your own. So the short story is Clean Mobility Options Program is a type of a clean vehicle incentive program that invests in zero-emission shared use mobility projects in California with the goal of increasing equity and investing in underserved communities. It's a new program that's funded by Cap and Trade and managed under the California Air Resources Board. And it is a program that CALSTART is managing with SUMSI. And I want to mention that Brian Holland, who is with SUMSI, has been a really key architect. And with SUMSI and also Grid Alternatives and Local Government Commission as key partners. I think I saw Linda Kamushian from Grid Alternatives on the phone, and I saw a few CARB colleagues as well. I think I saw Abba. So you folks should feel free to weigh in at some point. In any case, we're operating this as kind of a consortium administrative program. And the basic idea is that Clean Mobility Options works to create comprehensive investments in community-based, shared use, zero-emission vehicle projects that are both designed by and then led by local communities. And it's really focused on increasing clean transportation equity, which is something we'll talk more about. So just to say again, we've got a slideshow that you can view on your own, but I won't be showing it. So please check it out. Thanks.
All right, thanks, Ryan. And last, we'll hear from Ricardo.
Great, thank you. I also just wanted to give a shout out to Rudy and everyone at SUMSI for putting together what I think to be the first of its kind, perhaps, kind of a virtual conference. It's certainly the first that I've attended, and I think everyone at the team deserves a round of applause for pulling it off and doing a great job at it. So I'm here to talk about Washington State's Commuter production program. It's run out of the state DOT, and within the DOT, within our public transportation division. The Commuter Production Program, or CTR as we call it, is a statewide program funded at roughly $6 million biennium, so every 2 years, that requires local jurisdictions to work with large employers in developing transportation demand management plans for their work sites that encourage employees to commute to work more efficiently, walking, biking, carpooling, vanpooling, anything but taking a single occupancy trip to and from work. And with the transportation sector being the largest source of greenhouse gas emissions in Washington and for many other states across the country, it's a pretty sound greenhouse gas mitigation strategy. So a little background on the program. The Commuter Production Program was launched nearly 30 years ago in 1991 as really an air quality program with the underlying intent of reducing the state's petroleum dependency. At that time, the state was facing federal intervention due to poor air quality, and we needed to take local action to prevent that. And also in '89, the Exxon Valdez oil spill really hit home in Washington. Had the tragedy occurred in Washington in our backyard in the Puget Sound, the environmental and economic impacts would have been much more devastating than what occurred in the Alaskan Prince William Sound. Then beginning in the early 2000s, the program's emphasis shifted from reducing the state's dependency on petroleum and improving air quality to reducing greenhouse gas emissions and mitigating traffic congestion. This coincided with an expanding economy, particularly in the Puget Sound region, kind of the Seattle area, rising population, and kind of all the externalities that come with a booming economy, including air pollution and gridlock. With that, in 2006, the modern-day Commuter Production Program was established with the goal being to reduce commute trips in the AM and PM peak trip markets and to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. And the program has been successful. From 2007 to 2016, that period, CTR affected commuters left roughly 22,000 cars at home every weekday, instead opting to commute by bus, van pool, train, walking, biking, teleworking. And in that same period, it's estimated the program helped reduce over 33,000 metric tons of greenhouse gas emissions. Today, while the state and our partners really still focus on greenhouse gas emissions and traffic congestions, the program continues to evolve, this time toward promoting a more socially equitable transportation system and livable communities for all, really taking advantage of new mobility services and technologies. In the last 2 years, we've expanded our partnerships to include labor, social service providers, social equity advocates, new mobility companies, and others to develop transportation demand management programs that support all travelers in transportation markets, not just, white-collar desk job workers. And we've also put in new governance structures to kind of expand our reach, elevate the importance of the work, legitimize it kind of beyond the transportation community, and really to help support innovation. We're piloting programs that target shift workers, small businesses, older adults, first and last mile connections to and from fixed route transit. And I'll conclude by saying that these changes and the program's evolution has really suited us well to kind of effectively respond to the challenges and opportunities presented by COVID-19.
All right, great, thank you. So, I think as Andrew had mentioned off the top, there's a tremendous amount of energy happening right now, throughout various parts of society to move toward more aggressive and ambitious action on climate change. And I think, we've kind of gotten the impression from this panel that there's actually already some really great, interesting, compelling, and innovative actions that are taking place at the state and regional level. And so I want to ask each of you to just dig in a little bit more and tell us about where you see state and regional policy on climate heading in the next few years. Where are the opportunities? Where are the challenges? Andrew, I don't know if you want to jump in because you've been looking at this, pretty systematically over the last year or so.
Yeah, I get to be the sort of, I think I'm not attached to.
I'm sorry. I'm going to cut you off because I had forgotten that we had another poll. So this technology is, we're all learning. So the first thing before we get into the state and local, state and regional policy, we want to get a sense of the room of how you all think that your state is already doing on addressing carbon pollution from transportation. So do you think your state is doing a lot, doing a little, or the third response is, are you kidding? We're really not doing anything at all. So if you can answer that question to the best of your abilities, submit your answer, and then we'll come back and provide the results a little later on. And I apologize, Andrew, for coming.
No problem. So I guess I get to have the role of being a bit of an outsider, right? I'm not, I haven't been working in state government or doing the hard on the ground work that other panelists have been doing. So I get to just sort of throw ideas over the fence in some sense. And it seems to me, you mentioned, California being a leader, which is sort of obvious, but I've come to the, again, perhaps obvious conclusion that without states at this point setting targets of getting to net zero by some year, I think it's hard to work back to real strategies that actually deliver what we need. And I have found, I think we can talk about the various strategies that exist in transportation, and sometimes I think they're placed at odds. There's sometimes a bit of a division between technology-focused approaches versus behavioral change. To some extent, I think having a real target that says we have to get to zero helps to clarify some of those things, because you start to have to really work out the math of how you're going to get there. And I think, there are a lot of great programs out there, but it's rare to see something that is of the scale of, fully decarbonizing. For a lot of reasons, it's very, very difficult to do that. And I think even just forget the politics of it, just technically what it would take to get there, especially if you start to include things like freight, which other folks in the call know more about me, which are even harder, that gets quite difficult. So I'm a believer that really the only way, the ultimate driver is finding ways to set meaningful, credible targets to actually get to zero at insert your year. And there's a lot of debate about what that year should be, but there's something clarifying and simple, although very hard, about getting that done. So that's kind of where I sit from someone nicely floating above the fray a little bit outside of any of these particular organizations. So my fellow panelists can tell me all the reasons I'm unrealistic or impractical, but that's kind of where I've landed.
Well, if we want to be optimistic about it, we can look to California. And Ryan, why don't you just talk a little bit about your experience and how you've seen the progress of cap and trade in California, because it's been going on for a few years at this point.
Sure. So I guess I'm going to focus specifically on the Clean Mobility Options voucher program, but maybe just to kind of talk about cap and trade first. This is about a $2 to $3 billion a year revenue generator that the program generates for a wide array of clean transportation and other clean energy and climate investments. Number of agencies involved with using the money for reinvestment and pursuing various programs. And of those, there's the low carbon transportation program that CARB operates. And roughly I would think of three kind of main areas of investment with low carbon transportation. One of them is the medium heavy duty vehicle program, which includes the money on the hood basically for clean zero emission trucks and buses called HVIP. And then there's also the demonstration and pilots, which is more, kind of like investment funding. The second big one is what everybody in California, not everybody, but a lot of folks know, CVRP, and that's the funding to get a electric or fuel cell car. And then finally is the equity program, which is a portfolio of investments for vehicles that includes some really exciting shared mobility, shared use type programs. So that's what the Clean Mobility Options program is a part of. And so maybe, just a few things about background. So this is part of the equity portfolio. It's been operating for a few years in different versions with the shared use vehicle type programs. A few years back, CARB had funded the what were then called car sharing pilots, and there was around a couple years worth of investment in around 7 or so of these kind of individual car share pilots. And then there was this understanding that, wow, this is such an exciting opportunity for communities that this could increase by an order of magnitude or even more as far as communities where they're being invested in. And also it goes beyond car sharing and electric car sharing. It goes to microtransit, e-bikes, and other types of technologies. So that's sort of the underpinning of what we see as today as a statewide administrative program for clean mobility options, which we're in the process of launching. And just a couple of sort of details about it. We have $20 million this year to provide funding for community-based projects. And there's really two different components. One is the needs assessments, which we'll talk about in a little more detail later, is a specific investment that we're allowing for funding for. And there's up to $1 million that we will begin in June providing funding or taking applications for up to $50,000 per project to help communities figure out what are the best the needs and opportunities for mobility projects. And then we have another $19 million for actually doing the mobility projects with up to $1 million each. And that was originally scheduled for the summer. Things are now on hold because of COVID, but we're watching and hope to open that soon. We have another $8 million in the subsequent year for next year to do the program as well. So I guess it's just a very long way of saying we have a cap and trade program in California that is funding shared use mobility programs today. There's a ton of excitement around this. We're expecting to see a lot of applications, both for the needs assessments and the mobility projects, and getting just a lot of great community involvement and feedback in what is going to be shortly the launch.
Great. And I think, many people in other states who are wanting to advance, here's the results of the poll. So for most folks, they think their state is at least doing something, which is good. But then we're kind of mixed up between there's, a chunk of folks who think that their state is actually doing a lot. And I'd be curious to know which states those people are from. So maybe we can get at that in the chat. And a bunch of folks who think that we're not off the starting line yet. So it's actually a very good thing to hear from this group that you're starting to see progress being made, but it's not quite enough. And I think that tracks with a lot of the experience around the country. So jumping off of Ryan's comment, I think, in many states would dream of having funding to be able to use on innovative clean mobility pilots, including those that really focus on the equity question. And Eugenia, you've been involved in the TCI process, which is unique for a couple of reasons. One is that you have this kind of regional consortium of a bipartisan group of governors who have come together around this program. You've also had a lot of conversations about sort of what it would look like. So just take us a little bit inside what that conversation has been like about TCI in the Northeast and Mid-Atlantic, and where you've seen some of the opportunities pop up.
Sure. Also, I will note, Ryan, I lost the bet. My kid interrupted us first. Yeah, I mean, the conversation on TCI has a significant focus has been placed on defining equity and making sure that each of the states are willing to prioritize investments in vulnerable communities and redistribution that will deliver benefits to folks who have disproportionately borne the brunt of carbon pollution from the sector, or have had limited or no access to reliable transit and transportation for a long time. So, I mean, I always say TCI is really important because it's a potential revenue generator. Ryan spoke to the importance of having the money there, but I often say when I talk about TCI that it's one piece of a comprehensive strategy. This approach alone is not going to itself undo generations of bad policy and generations of bad planning, but it is certainly important that we acknowledge that disparity exists because of those things, and we try to reverse course. So specifically with regard to how dollars will be invested, there was a letter signed by a number of advocacy organizations last month, I guess, maybe 6 weeks ago, that specifically called for TCI participating states. So I forgot to mention, it's Connecticut, Delaware, Massachusetts, Maryland, Maine, New Jersey, Pennsylvania, Rhode Island, DC, and I might be missing one. The letter was calling for those states to make sure that there is an explicit commitment to public participation as states start to think about how to collect and invest these dollars. So one way to ensure equitable outcomes is to make sure that the folks who are actually on the ground and living with lack of access or the negative impacts are able to have a say in what the next thing looks like and how those dollars get directed. And it may well be that out of those discussions, we'll see recommendations for things like car sharing, EV car sharing programs, or investment in transit or what have you. But folks on the ground will know what it is that they are missing and what they need. So an explicit commitment to public participation, a commitment to identifying priority populations, so identifying and defining those populations, and then ensuring that the dollars get reinvested in those communities. This one is particularly interesting to me because I work in a state where a lot of the focus, I work in a part of the state where a lot of the focus is on urban centers. But when we're talking about the region where TCI is taking place, there are also rural parts of the state or rural states where the challenges around transportation and transit may be a little bit different. So what works in downtown Boston isn't going to necessarily work in the middle of a community in Western Mass. We have to figure that out, and that's the same is true. There's disparity between what Vermont needs and what New Jersey needs. So there's a concerted effort to try to figure out how to define those populations. And one of the things that COVID presents, ironically, is that because we've sort of slowed the process down a little bit, now we have a little bit more time to get those definitions right. And to at least, I think the main goal is if we can get the states to agree that we need to prioritize these communities, And as long as that's reflected in the memorandum of understanding, that when it comes time for individual states to implement, they can play a role in really crafting those definitions. And then the last thing around equity is really, and this letter states it, is just clarifying what the goals of TCI really are. So if we are generating these dollars with the aim of reducing emissions from the transportation sector, how are we doing that? This is so important to me. It really needs to be a focus and an emphasis placed on investing in good, innovative programs, not diverting dollars that are intended for that purpose to try to do things like expand highways or do things that will perpetuate the very problems that got us into this situation to begin with. So those are some of the ways that we're grappling with equity in the TCI discussion, and we're trying to think about how to address it regionally, and then also really drill down in each individual state.
Yeah, and I think that's a really excellent point. And going back to Ryan's presentation about the program with which he's engaged, which is sort of within a specifically designated equity-focused pool of investment, that coming up with those definitions and then actually being intentional about providing investment to support them is really critical. Ricardo, I wanted to come to you and I wanted to ask, so the Commuter Trip Reduction Program is not explicitly a climate program, and there are ways that we can reduce greenhouse gas emissions through programs that don't have the word climate in the name of them. And I was hoping that you could talk just a little bit about how do Washington State decision makers see your program as being part of addressing the climate challenge? How are you adapting the program to better reflect it? And sort of what do you see as being the interactions between transportation policy and climate policy?
Yeah, it's a great question. Well, clearly the link is strong there. With regard to the CTR program, it's the legislature decides how much money we get, right? And so that's kind of the audience. I mean, that's kind of our board of directors in a way. And so the most obvious and kind of immediate felt need is traffic congestion. And so that has been the primary kind of focus, if you will, of the program. And it's not just it's not just the rush hour. It's freight. We've got huge port industry in Seattle, both coming from the east to the west and from the north and the south. And so that's a real issue. There's also kind of a resiliency issue we've got I-5 running through the city of Seattle and I-405 running into the city of Seattle. If there's any incident along any of those corridors, it stifles traffic for everyone. And it can, in terms of emergency response, and it can be devastating. So those are the issues that really resonate most strongly right now. Greenhouse gas emissions has really taken a kind of a back seat to those issues. It's not, obviously our governor is great on the issue of climate, and his goals are mainly focused on electrifying the transportation network. But I think that's one of the challenges that we face is how do we link sustainable transportation and climate more strongly? Even for a governor who's as great as ours, the emphasis on the behavioral side of transportation, I'd love to see that be more emphasized. I mean, there's an understanding there, but I think there's an opportunity for kind of greater emphasis. Like I said, the program's funded at $6 million every 2 years. It's great that funding is there. It's consistent in terms of it's a very non-decentralized program. So it's the jurisdictions and cities that are running those programs. The fact that they can rely on that funding kind of year after year to build out their programs and to maintain the staff and to learn from their programs and to refine them over the years has been a huge benefit of the CTR program. I think the other opportunity for us is deeper involvement and partnerships with the more traditional environmental community. There is this singular, cars are the problem, let's convert combustion engines to batteries and we'll all be okay. But there's all, there's issues around place and placemaking and equity. There's lots of challenges and opportunities there. And I'd like to see deeper involvement in the, kind of with those partnerships. We are working on that. We are working on deepening those relationships with the environmental community at the agency level, kind of at the nonprofit level as well. And we're seeing successes, but there certainly is opportunity for room. There's room for improvement there, and we're heading in the right direction, which makes me optimistic.
Tony, if I could just add one comment. I think what makes transportation unique, I mean, I've done this for a long time in the electric sector. What makes transportation particularly unique to me is that it's easier to get folks to wrap their mind around it because transportation touches every aspect of their lives. So it absolutely dictates access to everything. Your job, your education, your housing, social mobility, everything. And it means different things for different people. So it is the one place where if we were to draw a Venn diagram, there is the technology piece, there's the behavior change piece, there's housing, there's economic development, but there's also at the center of all of those things are people. And I feel like it's very, it's not easy, it's just a little easier to approach it from a people-centric place, which is why at least, I mean, don't get me wrong, people don't know what TCI is outside of this community. And it's not like the average person on the street is walking around talking about cap and invest models and how they can't wait for $5 to $7 billion to be invested regionally, but we'll get there. But it is a way for you to start the conversation around climate in a different way that resonates more with people and hopefully ushers us into a better solution.
Yeah, and I'd absolutely echo that. Both your comment and then Ricardo's, that I think this, this challenge of how do we get the folks who have been working in the environmental community for a long time to sort of understand, the importance of investment in public transportation and shared mobility and in walking and biking and other kinds of, tools that can help us to reduce car dependence, which is incredibly energy intensive and resource intensive in all sorts of ways. And so I wanted to ask, and folks can just feel free to jump in, where is there an opportunity for shared mobility? And I want to just define that broadly to include transit as well as all of the private sector models that we've talked about here. But where are the opportunities for shared mobility to play a part in state level climate policy to address transportation emissions, either in creative ways to spend revenue from cap and trade or through other policies that we might adopt? Where's there the sweet spot to make that connection between environmental protection and sustainable mobility?
Hey, Tony, real quick. Christian Wachi had a question earlier, specifically for Ricardo. He asked what state agencies are involved besides Washington DOT, and what agencies would like to be involved, or would you like to be involved, but are not yet?
Great question. So CTR, state sites are affected. State work, so they're all kind of CTR affected. They have to have TDM plans in place for their employees. So that's kind of more passive. In terms of active, our Department of Ecology serves on kind of a newly established board. We call it the Transportation Demand and Management Executive Board. It is comprised of executives from the governor's office, from agencies, from Amazon, private sector, public sector. And so it's a diverse freight is involved there. And so they're at the table. And engaged. And we've got broad support from the governor's office, from Department of Ecology. So there's wide support on kind of multiple agency levels.
Tony, I can try your shareability question.
Sure, fire away.
I think Ryan's talking about some of the programs that I think are newly focused on different modes of transportation, including shared mobility. Because I think a lot of the past history of certainly focused on electrification has been on people buying a car for themselves and how you incentivize that behavior. And I think it's actually been hard for rental operators or fleet operators, even to access existing funds, let alone have funds targeted to those operators. So I worked, for many years at a ride-sharing company and had lots of conversations trying to encourage that company to invest more in electric vehicles. And it's hard to make the math work, honestly, in the short term. And also, they're not the owner of those vehicles. So are there ways that you can find to target fleet operators of various kinds? In this conference's context, seems like car share, ride share, which are not new, but I think the idea that, to me, there's a lot of logic to those changes, also potential benefit for the actual drivers on those services and the neighborhoods, the communities they live in, often line up with communities of concern in the case of California. So there's opportunities for like focusing on fleet electrification, because this sort of reality, I think, in the short term is that the pure math right now, just from a straight financial perspective, is not always on the right side of that trade-off today. And so how can you convert that? And there's ways to convert that that are more sort of friendly in subsidization, incentivization. And there's other places like New York that have, a cap on for-hire vehicles, but for electric cars. And there's actually been some uptake, a small number of electric vehicles actually been added to that fleet there. So there's, carrot and sticks in all things, but certainly looking at how do you combine those. And then I'll say a little bit related to that is that we talk a lot about electric cars, but it doesn't have to be a car, right? Electric bikes are really interesting. And so it's going to be an interesting moment with the economy that's happening, and I'm sure lots of conversation happening at this conference around what the future of the shared model is, but the hardware I think is pretty compelling around e-bikes, scooters, both in shared fleets and personally owned. So I know in New Zealand is the one place I've seen that has a subsidy that can be sort of swapped between cars and electric bikes and things like that. So if we get more interesting and innovative on the kind of vehicles that we're incentivizing, whether they're shared or not, I think there's opportunities to be a little more creative now that the last couple of years have seen kind of a whole new wave of vehicle type.
Mm-hmm.
Tony, can I add on to that? So there's been a lot of discussion about California, and my training is to be a little bit careful because I grew up in Oregon, and I don't want to rah-rah too much on California, but I think that what California has established is that programs like cap and trade, low carbon fuel standard, really serious utility investment in ZEVs, EVs, has shown that these things are really good for states and for communities. And they're the kinds of things that other states really should be pursuing. So that's kind of like the first thing. The second thing is, I think as far as like the super sweet spot, I would say that kind of like, in my view, a cutting edge is really policies that converge the goals of electric vehicles or zero emission vehicles with equity and with VMT or congestion reduction. And this Clean Mobility Options project that we've talked about is one type of that sort of a framework. There's others. Andrew mentioned a few good examples, and I have to cite California again. And this is something that, again, I'll mention Linda, who is now with GRID, previously with CalBike, was a part of. A bill was passed last year or the year before to include e-bikes in what was the basically a clean car, old car trade-in type program. So those kinds of technology, vehicle neutral programs are really smart because they do a lot at once. Also, if you think about electrification, one of the things that allows electrification of vehicles is one of the things that allows is the opportunity for utility programs, transportation management programs, other programs that are charging vehicles to give higher incentives for high occupancy vehicles or investments in certain areas, certain communities. And so if you think about these policies that are doing not just ZEV and not just VMT, but doing both and then advancing equity, I think that's really the cutting edge. And that would be my sort of concluding thought for policymakers, is to really think about how you can do as much as you can with those three things together.
I would agree wholeheartedly. If folks have to really put their thinking caps on and come up with creative solutions and also de-silo these issues. I mean, if we are talking about electrifying vehicles or electrifying fleets, then we need to also, as Ryan's saying, turn that into a conversation about how to leverage that as a resource to the grid when we get to that point, and turn it into more than just a mode of transportation, but now it's a clean energy option, a battery, a storage solution. So yeah, I agree with everything that Ryan just said, and Andrew as well. I think we just have to be creative. and be willing to not lock ourselves in right now with the perfect, don't let the perfect be the enemy of the good. We need some good policies that get us going, but we also need to recognize that the technology is changing very rapidly and the landscape is changing very rapidly. And so we need to be able to be nimble and respond to that as well.
I think if there's one word that I would love it if everybody in this session could take home and try to sprinkle into whatever it is that they're talking about. I think the word de-silo is an excellent one, because it really is the case that, when we do sustainable transportation right, when we do electrification right, it's not just a climate solution, it's a solution to a lot of problems that we're facing in our communities. And just to interject really quickly, while this is a forum about state level climate policy, we're also heading into a moment here where there already is a lot of money that is flowing around at the federal level, and looking toward the next couple of months in discussions about potential stimulus packages. There's going to be a lot of money that is going to be going somewhere, and so for those of us who are engaged in this stuff, I think paying attention to and really attending to where there are opportunities for kind of transformative policy work at the federal level, transformative solutions, and also where there's untransformative solutions or things that lock us further into our current, very inadequate transportation system. It's just going to be worthwhile for us all to pay attention to that. And I think for state policymakers who depend on federal funding for the work that they do as well, it's going to be a really important set of conversations. I want to encourage folks in the audience, we are going to turn to audience Q&A here in a few minutes. So if you have questions for the panel that you'd like to have voiced during the Q&A session, please start adding them in now. We're going to probably get rolling with that in about 5 minutes. But I wanted to ask, just as a final question to the entire panel for the moment, what would you say would be, if you had one thing that you wanted people from this conference to go and communicate to their policymakers about climate change and transportation, what would be the thing that you would have them, what do people need to hear? What do policymakers need to hear from the people at this conference? And that's a big
all
question.
the things. They need to hear all the things. I think at least from where I'm sitting in the Northeast, if you're in a state that's participating in TCI, I think policymakers need to hear that it needs to remain a priority, that it is an opportunity that states need to seize, and that the benefits will far outweigh any perceived risk or cost associated with trying to actually tackle emissions from the transportation sector. So I think the message is, thank you for doing the work that you've been doing. Thank you for staying dedicated and focused, and please get us over the finish line. And I think also that there needs to be a message that, again, the public engagement is important. Hear from people, prioritize equitable investments, and de-silo. Really approach this as more than just a single issue that we're trying to tackle, and recognize its connection to everything else. I only have a minute. I could go on and on.
Okay. Actually, if I can keep you for another 30 seconds to a minute,
Sure.
TCI has gotten a bit of pushback in the region, and can you just tell us a little bit about the nature of that and how advocates are responding to it?
Yeah, so some of the pushback that Tony's referring to is from more conservative groups who are citing, who are actually inaccurately citing cost burden to low-income and rural communities, vulnerable populations. There are also folks who have said, it's basically just a gas tax and we can't afford to raise the price of gas, although ironically at this moment, it's probably the time we can most afford to raise the price of gas. So the pushback there has been, or the response to that has been to demonstrate that actually the benefits outweigh the costs, There was some polling done in the region recently, at least in the Northeast states, that demonstrated that 66% of people are actually very supportive of investment in transportation and in transit, want to see clean energy investments. That aligns very well with very high support and broad support for action on climate change, and to see that as a priority issue. And I think we benefit, at least in some of the states that are involved, but certainly in Massachusetts, from having an administration that has been sort of at the forefront of the TCI conversation for some time, and has really recognized that it is a potential, or that it recognized its potential to ensure compliance with our mandated clean energy and climate greenhouse gas emission reduction. So as advocates, however, I think the pushback has, or the response has continued to be that the benefits outweigh the costs. We can point to very specific examples of how the program will really pay for itself. And more and more we're seeing studies linked or that are making the connection between increased exposure to particulate matter and ultrafine particulate matter from the transportation sector and from transit, and the impacts on health of low-income communities and vulnerable populations. So it speaks for itself.
Okay, great.
I was going to say two things, Tony, if I could. I think one is that on the sort of urban passenger transportation that we're talking about, I mean, one takeaway is just that there's not like a need for a magical technological breakthrough that hasn't happened yet. I think you could argue that in other parts of the decarbonization problem, but not here. So in some sense, sort of the set of solutions is out there. It may look different in different places, but it's available to take up and figure it out in your location. And the second thing I would say is that I think, you know, I have a great belief in the sort of power of the coming climate activist wave, and that I think that the transportation is now, as you pointed out, in the crosshairs as the sort of #1 target. And I think there's going to be more demands for more ambitious climate targets in transportation coming from people outside of traditional transportation. So if you're a policymaker, you know, it seems to me not a bad time for people like those who are on this call to start to think through, you know, even what would it take? Because I think maybe the political moment is turning. That's my optimistic take, and that there'll be more ambitious calls to move more quickly to zero. And so that's an opportunity, I think, if you've been waiting for someone else to come banging down the door and ask for more demanding action. I'm sort of hopeful that that's going to be coming.
Great. Ricardo, this is probably a slightly awkward question for you to answer since you work in state government, but what do people like you need to hear from people like us?
Stop demanding to build so many highways. I mean, that's really our biggest challenge. You know, we talk about breaking down silos, even within state agencies. You know, I mean, WashDOT's a 6,000 person agency. And overcoming the silos within our agency is a challenge we've been tackling for years now. And how do we do our transportation planning more holistically? We have a discipline called Practical Solutions, which is summed up with the right project in the right place at the right time. I don't even know if we can identify what the right project is right now, right? Depending on what stakeholder you talk to, an elected official, a local plan that's 20 years old, that's kind of what dictates where our investments are made. And we're working to overcome that. It is a challenge. It is multidisciplinary. There are multiple solutions that can replace, an expansion project or a new interchange. And that's really what we're focused on as an agency. And transit has to be, it's the least cost solution first. And that usually is a behavioral strategy. It may not be the only one, but let's start there. I noticed in the question and answers is the question of, COVID, post-COVID, how is this affecting our thinking on climate? The best trip is no trip. And for a state agency that resisted teleworking, telework, one of the main challenges of telework is getting buy-out from middle management. You have executives who support it, and there might be policies in place, guidelines and so forth, but it's the middle management who say, no, I want to see my staff in the office every day from 9 to 5. That's how I know whether or not they're working. That's disrupted, this period has disrupted that entire kind of paradigm. And WashDOT recently did a very statistically significant survey about 2 weeks ago, inquiring about telework and its effect, and overwhelming support. People are more productive, people are more satisfied. Very few people feel like they're not able to get the work done. Those who felt less productive, it was predominantly due to technology issues that have since then been overcome. And so we're really looking into that. Our secretary just announced that the new normal will be 50% of people, of state WSDOT employees will be teleworking permanently, or not permanently, but for more than 50% of the time. There's discussion about closing down offices and reducing our office space significantly. And the benefits of that are twofold. One, huge climate potential there, and impact. The other is saving some dollars when revenue is not as lush as it once was. So these are having real impacts, and I think we will further kind of explore what role can the state, what incentives can the state provide to continue to encourage not just WSDOT and other state agencies, but the private sector as well, to leverage this moment and the benefits that I think have come out of it, but particularly with regard to teleworking.
All right, and Ryan?
Well, I guess I already gave you the punchline, which is I think that the California Clean Mobility Options Program is a really promising model for other states, jurisdictions to consider. We didn't have enough time, I think, to really get into detail about equity and what it means and what it can mean for programs like this. So I guess I would just offer in brief that there is a pretty concrete blueprint that the Clean Mobility Options Program is using that CALSTART and I know CARB and SUMSI and others would be very happy to help folks understand better if they're trying to make this a little more concrete. But I guess I just offer a few things as far as principles to consider is one, the program is designing based on a recognition of serious barriers to clean transportation from an equity perspective. There have been reports, one commissioned by CARB a couple of years ago, or led in part by CARB a couple of years ago, another one by Green Lending Institute called the Mobility Equity Framework. And you can find this in my slide deck. Another one is, some states, and California's probably done the most on this, have really quantified and defined and mapped communities where you have more historical neglect in past and current issues, in particular low-income people of color. So that's a really important part of this. A third is to put community transportation needs assessments at the center and at the front of projects, and we have a methodology for that, and the others should just borrow from. A fourth is to make sure that you're putting the investment in the hands of communities by offering the ability to do flexible funding for comprehensive projects that allows kind of like whatever the community wants to do within certain bounds. And the final one is to really offer resource to get it done, with technical assistance being a major focus, and also bringing in technology innovators and mobility providers to support. So that's a really fast sort of summary, but those are some of the equity principles that the CMO has, and just encourage folks to understand that we have a pretty concrete way to go about this sort of work.
And Tony, I know we're short on time, but everything Ryan just described is really consistent with what was included in the letter that was submitted to the TCI states around equity for that particular program. The only other piece I would add that's not reflected anywhere that I am aware of, but is it is really important for states to also recognize that when we are investing in transportation, transit, and mobility solutions, that we focus on leveraging those resources to reduce emissions to hit our climate goals, but we don't lose sight of the importance and the value of micro level programs and projects and pilots, and what those mean for people in a community, or for very immediate benefits and impacts. Those things might not yield huge GHG emission reductions, but it could be a real game changer when we start to think about scaling up eventually. So we need to be able to balance both, and states need to recognize that when they're directing dollars.
Absolutely. There are a few questions. We're gonna pivot now to audience questions, but a few of the questions have to do with COVID. And so to get a sense again of where people are in the room, what do folks think the impact of COVID will be on mobility, at least based on right now, because a lot of it will depend on the decisions we make in the upcoming weeks and months, but based on what you think, will we be seeing a lasting change toward more vehicle ownership and driving, a Carmageddon situation? Will we be seeing a lasting impact toward less vehicle ownership and driving? Or will we be basically going back to how things were before? So if you want to answer that quickly, and we'll post the results a little bit later on. But now let's pivot to audience questions. And Pete, there was one that I wanted to make sure to tee up for folks, which is, in the short term, there's been a lot of conversation about this in the wake of COVID, but Pete, I'm not, okay. Sorry, technology.
You're good. Let me know if you need me to read anything out.
Sure. Do you see a role for state role for guidance and support for the slow streets, open streets efforts to reallocate public space to support non-auto travelers?
That's a great question.
Yeah. And jump in.
Yes.
I don't know. Oh, good. You take it, right?
Eugenia, go ahead.
Oh, I was going to say I don't know the answer, but I do know that we're seeing municipalities in Massachusetts pilot programs to take back the streets, so to speak. So it would be great to see that happen more permanently, but I don't know. I don't know the answer. That was like a non-answer. Maybe.
I mean, I'll offer, so others are more expert on this, and maybe more current on some of the state level kind of work, but as another just sort of a connection to the Clean Mobility Options program, if something were happening in California in a community that was interested in slow streets, if you do a bike share, scooter share program, we fund infrastructure, and you can do tactical urban type investments with CMO funding if it supports the bike share. So this is a way that state funding, you can sort of have a comprehensive approach to a shared program like that. I'm sure there's lots more that's happening, but I'm not close enough to it.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's been conversation, certainly around complete streets policies in a number of states, states like Massachusetts that have, adopted pretty good complete streets policies. I'm sure a number of others around the country. I think, as with many other conversations around COVID, there's an opportunity to accelerate work that was already happening because of the urgency of the situation. So, I think if you're working in a state, it's worthwhile to see perhaps what your state had already been doing and teeing up, and then see if there are ways to, to agitate for either, running out some short-term pilots in the short run, or to accelerate the urgency around the work that's already happening. Because in a lot of places there is at least some good stuff happening. I wanted to answer this question, pose this question to the panel. With COVID, we're seeing a closer link between transportation and access to health and medical services. Are there any state-level environmental policy developing metrics or providing funding for clean transportation programs using health-related criteria? And I guess I would maybe broaden that question to just ask, what are the connections between climate policy and health policy? And, again, are there opportunities to de-silo these policy conversations in order to, to address multiple problems with one solution?
So I'll jump in and say that, I referenced some of the studies that have come out recently that have, from Union of Concerned Scientists and others, that have made a direct connection between poor air quality, the pollution from transportation, and public health. The connections are undeniable. I am not aware at this moment of any organizations that are working to pull the data even more during COVID in particular, to try to make those connections. However, I think going forward, it'll be really interesting to see how the healthcare sector and others engage, and they're already engaged in things like the Transportation Climate Initiative discussion, because hospitals and healthcare have an obligation to not only care for and heal their communities, but they're also very present and involved as economic drivers and sometimes polluters. So there is a concerted effort made in that sector to address things like electrification and to make a compelling case for investments in electrification. But I'm not familiar with anything specifically related to COVID. I would just say that increasingly we're seeing the climate argument take a little bit of a backseat to the public health argument because the linkages are undeniable. And then the last thing I'll say is, at least in Massachusetts, it's also the idea that addressing climate change as a way to contain healthcare costs has also been introduced and raised as an important priority because the healthcare sector is so significant here in our state.
Great, thank you. Pete, I think do we have time for one more? Not sure how we're doing on the clock here.
Yeah, go ahead. We got 2 minutes, but
okay, great.
We can run a little over.
So, lightning round. I guess question, let me get to this last question. So this is from Matt Fromer from Colorado. It says, 100% agree with the call to de-silo. You all touched on this, but maybe you have more thoughts. In terms of climate policy, we're really good at the technocratic solutions. 100% EV will happen eventually. I'm less confident about VMT reduction mode switching because it requires systems change on multiple levels. So how do we elevate these strategies in climate policy making? How have CARB and TCI addressed this? How do we deal with VMT in 2 minutes? Panel. Andrew, what?
I'm a believer in, I think ultimately the most sustainable way to get mode shift to happen is through densification. I mean, like things like SB 50 in California, with all the controversy attendant kind of local land use battles. To me, it seems like the real way, the clear greatest driver of mode choice and travel behavior is land use patterns. And I think without the will to change that, in a place like Massachusetts, I think the average minimum lot size in Massachusetts towns is like a half an acre or something, like the minimum per unit lot size. So it's just impossible to think about developing anyway other than car dependent if that's your land use pattern. So I'm a big believer in transit, all the other alternatives, but to me the most lasting, meaningful way to get that is densification. And there are real movements pushing for powerful change. And I think linking the climate benefits of that with all the other sensible equity, cost, affordability arguments, to me that trumps everything else if you can get that done. That's hard, but I think everything flows from density in my view on the behavior change side.
I think the land use component question really is the toughest because it is so decentralized. You've got cities and towns and counties and states and, but I think Andrew's absolutely right. It's how do you build walkable communities? How do you build streets that incentivize people to walk on, not, or ride their bike on and not drive? How do you incentivize safe spaces? If we could crack that nut, I think we'd be okay. But as the audience member stated, that's one of the trickier challenges. And so I think we do default to that technocratic thing, right? It's technology will fix this. It will be an app, or it'll be a new battery, or what have you.
Well, I think, I'm sorry, Ryan, did you want to jump in quickly?
I'll be quick. I have two things I'm going to deviate from the clean mobility option stuff a little bit. First, this is not my quote, but I think it's a good one. It's all politics are local, and all local politics come down to parking. And I think that this is where a lot of this dies. and I think if you can get people into shared use projects, vehicles, or just get them e-bikes and put them on an e-bike. And that's the second point is if you find somebody who's predisposed to riding a bicycle and you give them an e-bike, there's nothing you could ever do to explain or to just tell them what it's going to be like. It's one of the few experiences of being bionic that people have, and you are blown away by just doing it. And if we had a national movement to do butts and seats for e-bikes, get them out there, get people on them. I know they don't work for everybody, but for a lot of people they do. You can't imagine what you'll do until you sit on one. And then I think you can start to whittle away at the parking problem when people realize that half of their trips they could do on an e-bike anyway. So leave it there.
And there's so much fun. All right, we need to wrap up. Pete, if you can run the results from the last poll, that would be great. And just to give you 15-second takeaways. So wow, we're all over the place. But your 15-second takeaways: 1, we need to de-silo these conversations to build broader coalitions and to stack the benefits so that people understand the transformative impacts of sustainable mobility. We need to ask our policymakers for all the things, including density, including more transportation options and electrification. There are some great things happening in the States, which we've already heard of, which you should engage in. And then lastly, there's tremendous urgency, but also great opportunity and a lot of reasons for hope. So I want to thank you all for being here. I want to thank the panelists for their time and wisdom, and thank Sumsi and Pete for pulling this entire event together. It's been great to be here. So thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And a big thank to all the panelists.